Welcome to Exegetical Tools Basic Greek videos. In these videos we're going through the various aspects of Greek grammar that would usually correspond to, say, Mounce's textbook or Machen's textbook or Croy's textbook. And we're looking today at the first aorist, active and middle indicative. So the formation of the first aorist, active indicative, there's two types of aorist, and so we'll get to the second aorist in the next video. But in this one, we're just looking at the first aorist, and this one has 5 different constituent parts, as you can see. If you're going to form this, first of all, you have an augment, and then secondly, you have that first aorist active tense stem. So for luo, it's simply lu, because luo is very regular, but for other verbs, it'll be different. Then you have a tense formative, which is sigma, and then an alpha connecting vowel. And then you have the secondary active personal endings. So if you remember, there's 4 different types of endings. There's the primary active, the primary middle passive, and then the secondary active and the secondary middle passive. The secondary endings tend to go with the more past time oriented tense forms. So in this case, you get the secondary active endings. Now, as we said, there's 2 different types of aorist. There's the first and the second aorist. They use different stems and different connecting vowels. The type of aorist in which a verb shows up doesn't affect the meaning of a verb, so you can have some verbs actually have a first and a second aorist form, but that doesn't change the meaning at all. It means the exact same thing, it's just that the form is slightly different. Now, the aorist tense form carries the perfective aspect. It presents an action as a complete, but not a completed, whole. So for this, an illustration of aspect, grammarians often use the illustration of a parade. If you were in a hot air balloon looking down on a parade, you would see the parade as one whole, complete action. Not necessarily completed, because it's not something that's in the past as you're looking at it, but you'd see it as a complete whole. You can see the beginning of it, you can see the end of it, and you can't really make out any internal details because you're really high up in the air, and if it's moving at all, it looks like it's crawling at an ant's pace. So you really just see the fact. If you were to say something, you would say there is a parade. On the other hand, if you were down on the ground on the sidelines of the parade, this would be more like imperfective aspect. You're no longer remote. You're no longer spatially remote from the action in the way you're viewing the action, but now you're right up on the sidelines and you're seeing it go by. You're seeing the people walk by. You're seeing the everything in the parade pass by your eyes as if you're in the middle of the action. So now you have an internal viewpoint to the action, and that's the basic difference between the perfective and the imperfective aspect. Now, the aorist tense form has the perfective aspect, so this is like you're up in the hot air balloon. When you use the aorist tense in Greek to express an event, you're expressing basically the fact of the event more so than anything like when it began or when it ended or what the action was like, what it looked like as it was going on. You're not really emphasizing any of that. You're just emphasizing the fact of it. So something like Jesus died for our sins, that's something you would likely put in the aorist tense because you're simply stating the fact that Jesus died. Nothing about how he died, how long it took, what it means, nothing like that, just he died. Okay, so that's the perfective aspect. Generally speaking, the aorist tense will be translated as a past tense verb, and generally with just a simple past English translation, like he died, he walked, something like that. However, the aorist tense form is not limited to the past tense. The aorist tense form can portray an action in the present, or the past, or the future. It's always presented as a complete action as opposed to something like progressive or imperfective action. It's always a complete action, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's in the past. There are plenty of examples in the New Testament where the aorist tense expresses something in the present or in the future. So don't assign the aorist tense with a one-to-one correspondence with the past, but generally you're going to end up with that sort of translation because generally, if you think of something like the hot air balloon, something spatially remote, generally you think of events as being spatially remote whenever they're removed from you temporally, perhaps distantly in the past. So we tend to talk about things distantly in the past as a whole or complete action rather than emphasizing its details. Something like I was born. back in the 80s. That's something that's I generally just say I was born, kind of like a perfective aspect meaning. Okay, so for further on that, you can see if we have on our website, see if we have an annotated bibliography on verbal aspect, which we should have. And you can do further reading from that. Now, as for the augment and the tense formative, these are really good indicators of the first aorist. So there's only a couple different forms that have an augment, the imperfect and the aorist. And then the perfect will have a reduplication, which is something different. So if you have an augment, you really just have to choose from the imperfect and the aorist. Clean this up a little. So that's a really good indicator. And then another indicator is the tense formative. When you have that sigma in the middle of a verb, like elusas, and especially the alpha, because sometimes that sigma will drop out with some verbs, but especially the alpha connecting vowel is your best indicator. So if you see an alpha connecting vowel, especially with an augment, that's a pretty good sign of a first aorist. And you see that the secondary active endings, remember the first person singular and the third person plural, the endings, as you can see here, are new. But the new in the first person singular is simply going to drop off, leaving the connecting vowel alpha as the last letter. So here you have elusa instead of eluson. And that really, that's good. It helps you distinguish from the third person plural, which does keep the new. And then the one other thing to notice is that the third person singular, the connecting vowel is alpha, but then it changes to an epsilon. So that also helps you distinguish it from the first person singular. If you didn't have an epsilon, you'd have elusa for two different forms, and it might get a little confusing. So you should get acquainted with the fact that the third person singular of the aorist is elusa or elusin. There's a movable nu. Sometimes it's there, sometimes it's not. So whenever you see that, whenever you see a first aorist form and you see an epsilon on the ending, you can be pretty certain that's the third person singular. The last thing here is that the square of stops holds for the aorist stems because of the sigma tense formative. As for the future, so for example, if you have blepo, you have a P there, and that P sound, when combined with a sigma sound, basically gives you blepso. So if we were to write this out, it would be like blep and then so. So you already have blepso. So this just go ahead, the square of stops comes into play here, and you just, the P sigma basically just turns in to a psi like that. Okay, so that happens a lot with first aorist verbs, so just be aware that the square of stops holds, and if you're uncertain about the square of stops, what that is, you can view our video on that to review that. With contract verbs, the contract vowel will lengthen before the tense formative. So, for example, with agapao, you can see how it's agapao, so there's an alpha before the end there, and so instead of staying as an alpha, the alpha actually changes, it lengthens to a, right here, you see this alpha lengthens to an eta because it's before the tense formative. So that happens with contract vowels, just something to be aware. It's not agapasa, it's agapesa. So those are just a couple things to be aware of with the first aorist. Now let's look at the actual chart. And you can see for the translations, I've just given it a simple past tense translation, but keep in mind that that's not always how you're going to translate it. And so you see you got elusa, rather elusa. You see how the accent's on the first character there. Elusa, and then elusas, elusa or elusin, depending on whether or not the nu's there. Elusamen, elusate, eluson. Okay, so this is a pretty regular paradigm. The only difference is, as we've said, that nu drops out in the first person singular, this nu, and then the third person singular, the alpha changes to an epsilon. So those are a couple differences, but this is generally a pretty easy paradigm to notice. Now as for the middle the middle is very similar, except you're going to have the secondary middle passive personal endings. So it's still perfective aspect. It's still usually going to be past time, but can be present or future. Everything still holds for the aorist tense. However, you're going to have different endings. So elusamein. So remember, the secondary middle passive endings are main, so, to, methes, the, onto. However, the so ending, in this case, see here on the second person singular, so is the ending. But if you look down here at the footnote, the second person singular ending so is used, but rather than contracting to u as in the imperfect, so you remember that's kind of the alternate form. You have so, and then in parentheses you might put u to help you remember. But in this case, it lengthens to so, and then you can see here these kind of contractions that occur. So elusaso, elusao, so that first sigma drops out there, and you get elusaso, elusao, and then the a-o contracts to an omega. So anyway, if that doesn't make sense, you can look it over for yourself. But that's how you get to here, to eluso. Basically just some contractions that occur. And the toe isn't, so everything else is very normal. So to pronounce these, we say them out loud. Let's clean this up. Let's pronounce these out loud. So this would be elusamein, eluso, elusato, elusamatha, elusasta, and elusanto. Okay, and these would be translated. The middle voice is not always something like with self-interest or generated by one's own power. Sometimes the middle can just be a simple active meaning that's different from the active form of the verb. So in this case, I've translated it I loosed for myself, but that's not always necessarily the case. You need to check a lexicon, something like BDAG or Danker's Shorter Lexicon. You need to check a lexicon to see what the meaning of a middle verb is. So in this case, this is I loosed for myself, you loosed for yourself, he loosed for himself, etc. That's kind of a rough translation of the first aorist middle indicative. Okay, so this is the aorist tense, form. It is the most common tense form to occur in the New Testament, so it is very important to memorize the aorist tense form and the paradigm involved. This paradigm, especially for the active indicative, very important. I would suggest saying it out loud multiple times. I'd suggest writing it out multiple times. And then perhaps if you have Bible works, you can go into their Greek paradigms and you can listen to the forms be read to you. And perhaps make some flashcards, make some mnemonics, whatever you need to do, whatever kind of learner you are, do what works best for you and get this paradigm down. So that's it for today. Thanks for watching, and I hope you come back for more.